Jane Doe arrived late at night in the Swamp City Hospital, where I was the head physician. It was just so perfect that night. A very quiet night with no major accidents, and I had spent the night watching videos on my phone when Jane Doe was wheeled in by the paramedics. Apparently, Jane Doe was found collapsed on Iguana Street by some late night revelers, and they all left their marks on her, which was clearly seen in the stab wounds, along with her chest, arms, and neck. Still, she was breathing, and apparently one of the revelers called Vanguard who brought her into the hospital. I thanked the paramedics as I wheeled Jane Doe into the quiet part of the hospital, my favorite part of the hospital. There was a quiet agreement between me and the paramedics. A J Doe in Swamp City found at night, that was fair prey for me and my appetites. Everyone knew Swamp City was dangerous at night, so anyone who was out late at night was either the ones who caused the danger or they were the ones in danger. While most of the predators went out on the streets, some of us had other obligations. Yes, even in Swamp City, serial killers had to have a regular job. Luckily, I found my niche here in the hospital. It was an open secret with the paramedics and with everyone who worked in the hospital. They would not turn me into the Vigiles Urbani, and I would never turn my appetite towards them, and they would keep feeding my appetites, and I would take care of the ill and sick in Swamp City. Do you know how hard it is to find good doctors of any kind? Do you know how much harder it is to get those good doctors to agree to work in Swamp City? Most of the good doctors were scared of those who scampered through the darkness. My skills were in high demand, and I was such a nice person during the day that people couldn't believe I would be someone who would hurt anyone. After all, I'm the doctor who always had a kind word, who brought donuts every morning, coffee every night, and who was willing to work overtime, and who didn't complain about all of the paperwork. I was just a really nice person to them all. So, if they did figure out my proclivities, they are willing to look away from that. After all, I'm perfectly nice to them. I'm so kind and giving that surely I cannot be a bad person. If I'm perfectly nice to them, then they only see me as a nice person. I'm not a threat to them, so I'm not a threat. If I never bite them, then surely I'm not a rabid wolf. It makes it so much easier for me to get away with my haste without being touched. After all, John, Jay, and Jane Does are so common in Swamp City. A lot of would-be wolves also take the wallet, but if they are lucky enough to survive, then they are brought to the hospital by the Vanguard paramedics. Unidentified persons are a lot of paperwork and a lot of resources. You have to get them to full health before you can even think about identifying them. Resources, time, precious money, and even more precious paperwork spent on these does that the hospital would prefer would not wander through our halls. Thankfully to the hospital administrators and to the imperial government, I am here. I have my own quiet section of the hospital where they can scream and cry loudly without any fear of being heard. I prefer it this way. I love the way they scream and beg. There's such a rush and excitement and almost amorous love in my heart, seeing their blood flow. The careful cut against the sensitive artery, and watching their life fade away and fall from their vulnerable body into my mouth. I'm sure the psychologist would say I had clinical vampirism, or Renfield syndrome, or deep seated psychological issues. But in all honesty, I don't care. Ever since I was a young child, I loved the way blood tasted on my tongue. The warm, salty copper that slowly spread across my tongue and filled my body with warmth and strength. Their life flowed into me. When I first started, I used my own blood, but as time went on, I realized I got so much more of a rush when I consumed the blood of others. So, when I was a trauma medic for Helots out in the front to the west, I drank every day, multiple times a day. There were dying soldiers everywhere and plenty of blood. No one had time to see why so many of the soldier slaves had cuts on their wrists and necks. Sadly, though, eventually the military police had to ask why the helots were dying so much. So I had to go somewhere where dead bodies weren't questioned. Swamp City. When I went into the quiet section, I locked the door behind me as I handcuffed Jane Doe to the bed. Common procedure for criminals, or patients who were a danger to others or themselves. For me, though, it was a different concern. Jane Doe's wounds had clotted, so she was no longer bleeding, but she had lost a lot of blood, and I didn't need her to catch an infection. Infection makes the blood taste too sweet. I set up an IV to slowly drip an anesthetic and saline into her circulatory system as I carefully cleaned her wounds. Yes, I was an amoral serial killer who drank human blood for paraphilic reasons, but I refuse to let any of that mean I am a bad doctor. My pride in being a good doctor is even stronger than my desire to drink Jane Doe's sweet ichor. When Jane Doe's wounds were all cleaned and bandaged, her IV bag replaced twice, it finally became time for her blood transfusion. I kept more than a few bags of O-negative blood in my workshop. One would think that I could just drink the donated blood for the same rush, except that I found that there was no rush in drinking donated blood. Sure, it tasted salty and coppery, but it felt like there was no life in it, no rush, no sweet craving with it. It was a lot like craving a burger all day and trying to eat a plain saltine. It did nothing for me, but it still served an important purpose. When this blood was warmed and then pumped through my prey's heart, filtered through all those kilometers of arteries, veins, muscles, and organs, the vitality returned to that salty metallic ichor. Since Jane Doe lost a lot of blood, she would need to replace it. I warmed the bags of blood in the saline bath. Blood cannot be reheated in a microwave. There were machines that could warm it gradually, or I could hold it in my hands and let it warm that way. However, I enjoyed warming it in a bowl of saline. The saline was warmed in the microwave and the bag was left in the bowl. It was a lot like thawing out a dinner. I warmed 2 liters of blood in 4 bags, as I tied one bag to the ivy and let it drip into Jane Doe's arms. The first bag drained quickly, and the other three drained quickly also. She must have needed the blood more than I realized. As the last bag drained into her, I grabbed her left wrist. I ran my fingers up and down her bruised, pale wrist, finding her vein. I took out my favorite scalpel as I gently sliced it. At first, there was just the white cut. Then bruising formed around the cut, as the first red jewel beaded from the cut. My tongue licked her slightly salty skin as the drop of life flicked across my tongue. I had tasted a lot of blood before, but something about this Jane Doe's blood was intoxicating. It was like her blood gave me the ability to control my thoughts, my body. Before I knew it, her cut had stopped bleeding, and I had already swallowed a mouthful of blood. I needed more, a lot more. I made another cut on her other wrist, and when that failed, I made a cut on her leg. And when that too healed, I went to her other leg. And finally, out of my final desperation, I made a cut on her neck, and I started pumping cold blood directly from the fridge into her body. Normally, I wouldn't have done that. Taking blood directly out of the fridge is usually fatal, but not for Jane Doe. I would pump fresh blood into her wrist while I kept making fresh cuts on her neck. Drinking the blood from her neck, every rush and every joy in life was paltry compared to what I was getting from her body. But in time, even though I was still getting blood from her neck, it no longer had the same rush. Maybe the last of her original blood was gone, and now she was full of nothing but donated blood. I bandaged her neck and glanced down at my little sheep. She was so pathetic, helpless, and beautiful. I had eaten my fill before, but I think this was the first time I completely replaced someone's blood. Stay here. I'll have more use for you tomorrow, I told the sleeping Jane Doe, as I made sure there was enough saline and anesthetic to keep her asleep for 24 hours. I made my way out of the quiet section, still full of the glowing feeling from my meal. There was definitely something special about Jane Doe, and I was going to keep her for a long time. When I made my way to my station, I kept watching videos, dimly aware of the other nurses and physicians glancing my way. I barely paid them any mind. It didn't matter. They probably noticed that I was a lot more me tonight than most nights. Let them stare. Nothing was taking this high away from me. Before I knew it, the shift ended and the sky was starting to lighten. My buzz was a bit weaker, so when I clocked out for the night, I stepped out into the streets of Swamp City as I made my way home. The early morning twilight barely lit the streets, and the lights were still on as I stepped over the broken glass and scattered blood puddles. Swamp City always lost a lot of people every night, but still the population didn't seem to drop or deplete in any way. Maybe the killers only got the most vulnerable, those who weren't likely to appear on a census. That may certainly be the case, but how would the most vulnerable die every night? And yet have enough the night afterwards, to be killed again. There had to be people coming into the city to be killed, but where were they coming from? I wondered these thoughts as I wandered through the streets as I made my way through a main road when someone stepped in front of me. The man in front of me kept his face hidden in the shadows, but I could see he was wearing a greaser jacket and slicked back hair with clotting blood keeping it in place. Clearly, he was in love with the looks of the 2700s, and I could hear two of his goons step behind me. Fuck, I whispered to myself. I specifically traveled this way because it was clearly public and unlikely to be attacked. I wasn't scared of this wannabe, but I also didn't feel like fighting on my way home. That's why I avoided alleys. Prowlers loved hanging out in them, but maybe I could talk my way out of this. Did you have good pickings tonight? I asked the leader, who only peered at me from the darkness, his blue eyes shining. He withdrew a buck knife from his waist. It was clearly dulled from use tonight, but the way it shone, he took good care of his weapon. He just got a lot of use out of it. I glared at him with my arms crossed. If he wanted to play this game, I could play this game. Go home, pup. Don't try to bark at a big dog if you can't bite, I said, hoping the look in my eyes was enough to send him away. Instead, I felt a sharp sting in my back as one of his goons stabbed into my back, right between my lungs. Enough bite for you? The man before me whispered as his goons grabbed my shoulders and pushed me onto my knees. As I was forced onto my knees, he grabbed his knife and pressed it into my throat, dragging it across my trachea to both sides, stopping just short of my spinal column. I could feel myself choking when his knife slid into my throat. The cold metal burned everything it touched as it cut and slashed through my muscles, skin, and tissue. He withdrew the blade, and I noticed there was no blood on his blade, while he stared at me quizzically. "Why don't you bleed?" he asked me, as I realized the burning in my neck was gone, and I could breathe again. I reached for my neck, and I could feel an uncomfortable flap of skin around my neck, but it was closing, even as my fingers flipped between the skin. It was quickly sealed up, leaving only a scar behind. Judging by the pain in my back, the blade in my back was still there, and my body wouldn't heal while it was there. Before I could figure out a plan of action, something overcame me. It was like anger, filling my entire body and pushing out of my fingers. My hands rose to meet the ruffian's neck, and I could see from my fingertips there were red claws that extended out of my nails. Even in the low light, I could recognize what the claws were made of. They were made of blood. My blood. My new claws dug deeper into the ruffian's neck, and I watched as his face grew pale and blue. Every beat of his panicked heart grew weaker under my hands as his life poured into my fingertips. Even as the ruffian died from my disembodied hands and his blood flowed into me, it was just so wrong. There was no rush, no beauty, no victory, no high from his death. It was an ugly thing, something I didn't even want, even as my hands finally let go of his neck. Something was controlling my hands and my blood, and it wasn't me. My anger now turned from the ruffian to his two stunned goons behind me. When they saw me turn, they immediately ran. I wanted to turn away. I wanted to let them go. I figured it was safe. They saw their boss die to a much stronger wolf. Surely the puppies would go home safe and live their lives, right? What possessed me disagreed. I felt my face contort into a monstrous grin as the blood began to bead from my wrist and arms like sweat, dripping down into my fingertips, but instead of falling, the droplets crawled over each other like ants, and forming into two long, tentacle-like appendages surrounding my hands. As the goons made their way to the end of the block, my arms swung towards them both, and the ends of the tentacles wrapped around their necks. I screamed through my own sick grin as I dragged them back towards me. I could feel their lives drain into my own blood tentacles as I dragged them closer and closer, my fingers digging into their neck as the blood crawled up my arms and body. Every drop of the goon's blood joined my own as it slithered up my arms, neck, cheek, and chin. My mouth opened against my will as the sour blood slinked down my throat. The feeling of the blood on my skin, it wasn't like anything I've felt before. It was a bit similar to a snake, including how it moved. It was smooth, and it left not even a stain behind, as every droplet, every molecule, found its way back into my body. The blood was alive. Not alive in the way I understood blood, but it was sentient, and quite possibly sapient. It was hungry, and even though I tasted it again, it didn't taste right. It was like bile from vomiting, but it was constant, and you had to swallow all of it without letting it out. And my body was still smiling until the last of the blood made its way into my body. I tried to scream, to make a call, to do something, anything. But now I was a permanent passenger in my own body. I walked home, showered, and slept. My body was under control that wasn't my own. All I could do was watch as my body moved without my will, and I learned about my new existence. One of the first things I learned was that even as my body slept, my own mind didn't rest. I couldn't move. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear the sounds of the outside world, but I was stuck with just me and my thoughts in the darkness. Do you know how long it is when you are not able to sleep, but you're unstimulated the entire time? The only thing I could do was think. My thoughts wandered through what I understood about blood. I knew that blood didn't simply live in the vessels. It also soaked into the tissues, organs, and even the bones through the marrow. Since whatever was controlling me was letting me think, then it was because it wanted me to be able to think, or it was unable to snuff out my consciousness. Still, though, it would take a lot of blood to completely replace all of my blood. Blood would be about 10% of my body weight, with about 5 liters in my vessels. Considering the fact my weight is at 100 kilograms, and blood is almost the exact same density as water, then that would mean the amount of blood in my body would need to be replaced. It had to have already been replaced by now. Have you ever felt your own heart sink even though your heart remains calm? It's disjointing to know you're having an emotional reaction, but your body isn't reacting. It's like your entire body is a stranger to you, and the part of you that's you is even smaller than you thought. Barely a spark behind the eyes, and you're just hoping that remnant of you doesn't get snuffed out by a dark force beyond your comprehension. I drank at least 3 liters from Jane Doe and 15 liters from the Goon Squad. Even the absolute best case scenario where I had 10 liters to be replaced, then my blood would be completely gone. Sure, blood could eventually be replaced by the marrow in my bones, but I had a feeling that this possessive blood had developed ways to adapt. When my body eventually woke up, I was dragged over to the mirror, where my body admired myself while I was stuck as the captive audience. I watched as the entity brushed my teeth, my hair, and washed my face. And yet, even through all of that, I only saw death behind those eyes. That spark that I saw as myself wasn't there, not even visible to me. Even as the days and then weeks passed, those eyes still looked dead. I watched as Jane Doe was let go. No words exchanged, just gone. Out into the world. Probably a honey trap for other wolves out there. I watched as it slid into my world, and no one in the hospital noticed it wasn't me. My body laughed, cracked jokes, brought donuts, and saved lives. Like normal. The only real difference was this entity didn't possess my proclivities. No more drinking blood from the beautiful and helpless. Instead, for a few hours every morning, it would lead my body along to hunt the ugly wolves. Those killers who stalked the streets at night were weak and vulnerable in the early morning, tired from their hobbies and feeling safe in the early light. I could only watch as this thing drained the blood from their necks and left them for dead on the streets. Not even a drop of blood left behind. There was no rush, no joy. In my mind, I could still feel my body react to it. It felt joy in the killing, felt excitement in the hunt, and it felt sated from drawing the blood. Feelings I didn't want to feel forced into me by my environment, like being in a screaming concert never able to leave. And here I remain, prisoner in my own skin, a wolf muzzled, collared, and leashed by a master within my own heart. But I still think I can escape. Someone or something took Jane Doe down. Something drained the blood from her, and if that something found her, then that something could find me.